Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that for years, perhaps your entire life, you've never experienced a single moment of true silence. Not the absence of sound, but the terrifying void where you're finally forced to hear yourself. The self you've been systematically drowning in noise. That was me. Every day, an orchestrated symphony of distraction. My alarm would fade seamlessly into a morning podcast, voices discussing world events, filling my head before my own thoughts could form. The shower's white noise wasn't enough. Waterproof speakers delivered motivational talks that echoed against the tiles. Breakfast with news videos. The commute with carefully curated playlists or audiobooks. Workday with collaborative playlists. Lunch breaks scrolling through video content. Afternoon meetings in my ears. Evening television. Nighttime sleep sounds. The cycle perfect, unbroken, complete. The gaps between these sounds lasted seconds at most. The time it took to switch apps, to connect to new speakers, to find the next source of noise. Perhaps the most significant tragedy isn't hating yourself, but being a complete stranger to yourself. I didn't recognize it as addiction until the first time my battery died unexpectedly during a subway ride. 20 minutes without sound, 20 minutes that felt like drowning, but inversely, as if I was finally breaking the surface of water I hadn't realized I was beneath. My heart raced, my palms sweated. My mind, unoccupied by external stimuli, began producing thoughts that seemed foreign, intrusive. By the time I reached my destination, I was nearly in tears, fumbling with chargers, desperate to reconnect. My playlist of life was perfect, as long as I never had to hear my own thoughts. What began as convenience had become necessity. What started as enhancement had become evasion. Technology offered me the perfect gift, never truly alone and never truly present. And then came the storm. It wasn't supposed to be a digital detox weekend. The remote cabin in the mountains was simply meant to be a change of scenery, a backdrop for my carefully curated soundscape. I'd packed battery packs, speakers, tablets, laptops. The arsenal of a man unconsciously prepared for siege against silence. The lightning struck just after sunset, not the cabin directly, but close enough. The surge that followed wasn't dramatic, no sparks or explosions, just the quiet death of everything electronic I'd brought. Phones wouldn't power on. Laptop screens remained black. Even my watch, with its constant notifications, surrendered to darkness. The tempest that destroyed my electronic devices became, ironically, the perfect storm for my internal awakening. As Thoreau observed in Walden, we are not rich by what we possess, but by what we can do without. Reflect with me. When was the last time you experienced true silence, without choice, without escape? That moment when your mind finally had to face itself? Share in the comments your experience with forced silence. Perhaps it was a power outage, a retreat, or simply a moment when your battery died in the wrong place. What emerged in that temporary vacuum of stimuli? The first hour was irritation. The second, boredom. The third, restlessness. Then came the panic. It arrived silently, ironically, a quickening of breath, a tightness in my chest. Standing by the cabin's window, watching lightning illuminate the landscape in strobing snapshots, I felt the first wave of genuine terror I'd experienced since childhood. Not fear of the storm outside, but of the storm I sensed gathering within. I had become an expert at drowning silence before it could drown me. Without sound, without voices, without the constant input of others' thoughts and creations, I felt myself dissolving. The boundaries that separated me from the emptiness seemed to thin. The silence wasn't empty. It was cavernous, alive, waiting. And I was falling into it without a tether. That first night I tried everything. I hummed. I talked to myself. I even tried to sleep, though it was barely 9 p.m. Anything to avoid the sensation of free fall that came with complete quiet. The feeling reminded me of those dreams where you're suddenly dropping, your body jerking awake just before impact. Except there was no waking from this. What frightened me wasn't the silence itself, but what it might reveal about me. I lived in a noisy theater where the spectacle never ended because I dreaded what might emerge when the curtains finally fell. What if, beneath all the layers of sound I'd wrapped around myself, there was nothing substantial? Or worse, what if there was something I couldn't bear to acknowledge? Technology had offered me the perfect gift, never truly alone with myself and never truly present in my life. The constant influx of voices, music, and information wasn't enhancing my existence, it was replacing it. I had outsourced my inner monologue, delegated my emotional processing, and externalized my very consciousness to the glowing screens and endless audio streams that surrounded me. That night, alone with nothing but the sound of rain against the roof and my own breathing, I began to suspect that what I had been calling life was actually an elaborate system of avoidance, of myself, of mortality, of meaning. The truth was simultaneously obvious and earth-shattering. I had no idea who I was without my carefully constructed soundscape. The theater of distraction where I had spent my days was about to present its most revealing act, and I was simultaneously the reluctant audience and the unprepared protagonist. This type of journey into the interior of silence is precisely what I aim to bring to you through this channel. If these reflections resonate with something deep within you, consider supporting the Shadow Therapist through Patreon. Your support isn't merely a material contribution, it's an investment in the increasingly rare contemplative space in our hyper-connected world. Each patron enables me to dedicate more time to exploring these caverns of the human psyche and bringing to light philosophical treasures that would otherwise remain buried beneath the noise of commercial content production. The link is in the description for those who wish to become archaeologists of the soul on this collective journey. What awaited me in those coming hours of enforced silence would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself, about connection, about what it means to be present in one's own life. As the hours crawled by in that silent cabin, I began to understand something crucial about myself. I had never developed the muscles needed for stillness. Like an astronaut suddenly finding himself without the familiar weight of gravity, I floundered in this new environment, unsure how to orient myself without the constant pull of noise. The first 6 hours unfolded like stages of withdrawal. At first, mere irritation, checking my dead phone repeatedly as though my frustration might somehow resurrect it. Then, restless boredom, pacing the cabin, opening books only to close them minutes later, unable to focus on printed words without the accompanying soundtrack I'd grown dependent on. Finally, a creeping, unsettling discomfort that felt physical, an itch beneath the skin, a hollowness expanding in my chest. It was around hour 5 when I caught myself humming aggressively, creating makeshift rhythms by tapping on surfaces, even talking aloud to the empty room. Anything to fill the vacuum. Anything to avoid what was beginning to surface in the silence. Jung understood that our shadow grows proportionally to the light we cast in another direction. The more I attempted to avoid my thoughts, the more insistent they became. And as night fully descended on the cabin, I found myself face to face with a question I'd been evading for decades. When exactly had I become so terrified of silence? The answer came in fragments, memories I'd successfully buried beneath years of carefully curated playlists. I was 14 when my parents announced their separation over dinner. Their words were measured, rehearsed, an attempted cushioning of impact that failed entirely. What followed that announcement wasn't shouting or drama, but something far worse. Silence. Weeks of it. Heavy, pregnant silence that filled our house like poisonous gas. In that vacuum, my adolescent mind constructed catastrophic narratives. The silence became a canvas for my worst fears. Without information, without processing, without conversation, I filled the gaps with imagined disasters. And I learned, unconsciously but thoroughly, that silence was dangerous, a space where painful truths and unbearable emotions multiplied like bacteria in perfect conditions. My solution was brilliantly simple. Eliminate silence entirely. Noise wasn't merely a habit, it was my religion, my addiction, my very identity. The pattern began with a radio that played continuously in my bedroom, then headphones that accompanied me everywhere. When technology evolved, so did my arsenal against silence. Smartphones, Bluetooth speakers, smart home devices, each innovation offering more sophisticated ways to ensure I never had to confront the void. I constructed this architecture of distraction methodically, without consciously understanding what I was building or what I was avoiding. Each new technology, each new subscription service, each new podcast series wasn't just entertainment. Each was a promise. You need never face the unknown within yourself. What I couldn't see then, but was beginning to glimpse in that forced silence, was how this pattern had expanded beyond mere sound. My relationships had taken on the same quality, surface-level connections that provided enough noise to drown out deeper questions. Friends with whom I could discuss politics, sports, movies, work, anything but our inner lives. Dating partners chosen more for their ability to fill empty spaces than for genuine connection. Even my career in digital marketing, always chasing trends, always producing content, served the same function. Carl Jung, with his penetrating psychological insight, would have recognized this pattern immediately. He spoke of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we repress, deny, or simply fail to recognize. The shadow isn't inherently negative. It's simply the unknown or unacknowledged parts of our psyche. But the more we push it away, the more power it gains over us. My external noise was a sophisticated defense mechanism against my internal noise. The voices of doubt, fear, unprocessed grief, unacknowledged desires. These weren't monsters necessarily, but they were strangers. And I had made sure they remained strangers by never allowing them the silence they needed to introduce themselves. The external noise was merely a symptom. The diagnosis was fear of inner emptiness. It struck me, sitting in that silent cabin, that I wasn't unique in this avoidance. Our entire culture seems engineered to prevent silence. We've constructed a society where constant stimulation isn't just available, it's practically mandatory. Waiting rooms have televisions, elevators have music, retail spaces have carefully designed soundscapes. Even our moments of relaxation often involve Netflix binges or social media scrolling. Recent studies show the average American now consumes over 11 hours of digital media daily. Nearly 70% of their waking hours spent in voluntary exposure to external stimuli. This isn't coincidental, it's a collective coping mechanism. Friedrich Nietzsche observed this tendency over a century ago, before our digital age made avoidance infinitely easier. He wrote, "The modern man does not want to look into anything, to be incapable of calmness, to be immersed in something." He recognized that this avoidance wasn't incidental but intentional, a collective turning away from the discomfort of self-confrontation. Our favorite distractions are our most accurate maps. They point precisely to what we're avoiding. Look at what captures your attention most reliably. What content do you consume most eagerly? What activities do you turn to when feelings of discomfort arise? These aren't random preferences. They're sophisticated evasion techniques, carefully calibrated to protect you from specific internal territories you're not prepared to explore. My own distractions revealed patterns I'd never noticed. My preference for political podcasts kept me righteously angry about external problems rather than addressing my own. My habit of falling asleep to documentaries about distant historical events kept me safely removed from my present reality. My social media consumption fed me carefully curated glimpses of others' lives, allowing me to obsess over their journeys rather than navigate my own. This realization was simultaneously obvious and devastating. I had been using noise not to enhance my life, but to avoid living it fully. I had been mapping my internal territory not to explore it, but to identify which areas to avoid at all costs. What would happen if I stopped running? What would I find in the silence I'd been evading for decades? What parts of myself had been trying to speak, only to be drowned out by the constant cacophony I surrounded myself with? As my first night in the cabin stretched into the early hours of morning, I began to understand that my relationship with noise wasn't merely a habit to break, but an identity to question. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was existentially threatening. Because without my carefully constructed soundscape, who was I? What remained when all the distractions were stripped away? The answer waited in the darkness, patient after all these years of being ignored, ready to reveal itself whether I was prepared to listen or not. The second day of silence arrived with the morning light filtering through cabin windows, finding me exhausted yet unnaturally alert. Sleep had come only in fitful bursts, each awakening more disorienting than the last. Something was happening to my mind, a process both terrifying and, I was beginning to suspect, necessary. Around the 24-hour mark, the quality of the silence changed. Or rather, my perception of it changed. The external quiet remained constant, but internally, a storm was gathering. My mind, deprived of its usual diet of external stimulation, began producing its own chaos. As if to compensate for the missing input, it turned up the volume on everything I'd been drowning out. Memories I hadn't accessed in years surfaced with alarming clarity. Not the curated highlights I occasionally revisited, but the uncomfortable fragments I'd successfully avoided. The look of disappointment on my father's face when I chose not to follow his career path. The tremor in my ex-partner's voice during our final conversation. The gradual dissolution of friendships I'd been too busy to maintain. These weren't organized reflections, but jagged shards cutting through my consciousness without warning or context. In the silence, I discovered my mind was like a caged predator, violent not by nature, but from confinement. What emerged wasn't only memories but emotions I'd never fully processed. Grief for relationships that had withered from neglect. Shame for potential I'd squandered while distracting myself. Anger at a life half-lived behind the protective wall of noise. These weren't gentle waves of feeling but tsunamis, overwhelming in their intensity, precisely because they'd been dammed up for so long. Researchers at Harvard have documented what happens during extended periods without external stimulation. The default mode network, brain regions active when we're not focused on the outside world, becomes hyperactive. This network processes autobiographical information, contemplates the future, and examines relationships. In essence, it processes exactly what we avoid when we fill our lives with noise. By hour 36, I found myself on the cabin floor, back against the wall, experiencing what can only be described as an emotional collapse. Not a cinematic breakdown with sobbing and wailing, but something quieter and more profound. A simultaneous recognition of how much time I'd wasted and how little time remained. At 42, I calculated I'd spent approximately 30 years in active avoidance of myself. 3 decades of strategic distraction. Over 10,000 days of running from the very consciousness I'd been granted. The pain wasn't finding something terrible within me, but realizing how much time I'd wasted fearing this encounter. Mortality became suddenly, viscerally present. Not as an abstract concept, but as a physical sensation, a clock ticking inside my body, measuring out a finite resource I'd been squandering. Each podcast, each mindless scroll, each binge-watched series, represented time forever lost, time that could have been invested in genuine connection, in creation, in the pursuit of meaning. Studies on deathbed regrets consistently show the same patterns. People rarely regret working too little or accumulating insufficient possessions. They regret relationships neglected, authentic paths not taken, lives not fully inhabited. In my relentless pursuit of distraction, I had been actively manufacturing my future regrets, day by noise-filled day. Nietzsche's words haunted me with new significance. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. I had always interpreted this as a warning. Be careful what darkness you confront, lest it contaminate you. But in that cabin, I understood its deeper truth. Nietzsche was right. When I looked into the abyss of my inner emptiness, it didn't merely look back, it spoke with the voices of all the versions of myself I had silenced. I pause here, because I realize this journey into the abyss isn't mine alone. There's a moment in human experience that transcends the individual. It's when we recognize a truth that resonates beyond words. Sartre called this existential nausea, that uncomfortable moment of clarity that connects us to what is fundamentally human. If these words have awakened that familiar unease in you, that silent recognition of a truth you've always known but rarely faced, consider marking this moment. Leave your like not as superficial approval, but as an act of courage. a silent testimony that you too allow yourself to look into the abyss when it returns your gaze. It's in moments when we recognize our collective shadows that we become more human, more connected in our shared vulnerability. The voices from my abyss weren't demons, as I'd feared, but the multitude of selves I'd abandoned along the way. The child whose curiosity I'd exchanged for cynicism. The young adult whose creative impulses I'd sacrificed for practical security. The potential partner, friend, creator, thinker I might have become had I not been so busy avoiding myself. As our 40 became 41 and 41 became 42, I tried increasingly desperate strategies to escape this confrontation. I attempted to recreate music in my head, humming melodies that quickly dissolved into incoherence. I tried counting, first forward, then backward, then in prime numbers. I attempted to sleep, though my body thrummed with adrenaline. I even resorted to physical discomfort, pinching my skin to create a distracting sensation. Nothing worked. The silence had become impenetrable. The death I feared wasn't in the future. It was in the present, in the unlived life I maintained while hiding from myself. Modern psychologists call this experiential avoidance, the attempt to escape or avoid private psychological experiences, even when doing so creates harm. Research suggests this pattern is linked to numerous psychological issues, from anxiety and depression to decreased life satisfaction. What we resist doesn't simply persist, it intensifies, demanding recognition with increasing urgency. Our 47 brought the moment of surrender, not an ecstatic breakthrough, but an exhausted acceptance. I could no longer outrun, outthink, or outmaneuver the silence. I could no longer sustain the energy required to avoid myself. The strategies that had served me for decades, the noise, the distraction, the constant motion, had all been stripped away, leaving me with the one thing I'd spent a lifetime avoiding: presence with myself. The silence hadn't created my inner chaos. It had merely removed the final barrier between me and the truth that had always been there. This is the paradox that few self-help books are willing to address. The path to peace often requires passing directly through chaos. Genuine transformation demands a confrontation with precisely what we've been avoiding. The discomfort isn't optional or a sign of failure. It's an essential component of the process. As the second day of silence gave way to the third, something began to shift within me. Not a dramatic epiphany or spiritual awakening, but a subtle change in my relationship with the silence and with myself. The chaos didn't vanish, but my resistance to it began to dissolve. And in that surrender lay the beginning of something I couldn't yet name but could faintly sense on the horizon. Like the moment when a storm has exhausted its fury but before the sky fully clears, that liminal space where destruction and creation hang in perfect balance, I found myself in a strange new territory, neither fighting nor embracing, simply being. What emerged in those next crucial hours would fundamentally alter how I understood not just silence, but consciousness itself. The transition began subtly, somewhere around the 48-hour mark. I was sitting by the cabin window watching dawn break over the mountains when I noticed something strange. The quality of my attention had changed. The mental chaos hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had settled somehow, like sediment in water. For the first time since my devices died, I wasn't fighting the silence or trying to escape it. I was simply in it. What followed in those next 12 hours was unlike anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't a dramatic spiritual awakening with angels and epiphanies. Instead, it was like watching a lake gradually calm after a storm. Ripples becoming smaller, waters clearing, depths becoming visible. The first thing I noticed was my breathing. Without consciously deciding to, I had begun to breathe more deeply, more rhythmically. My shoulders dropped from their perpetually tense position. My jaw unclenched. My body seemed to be remembering a natural state it had long abandoned. Then came the clarity, not all at once, but in waves of increasing lucidity. Thoughts still arose, but they were different now, cleaner, more complete, less fragmented. It was as if all those years of noise had been forcing my mind to think in shorthand, in incomplete sentences and half-formed ideas. Now, in the silence, thoughts could unfurl to their full dimensions. I found myself recalling memories I hadn't accessed in decades, not the painful ones that had flooded me earlier, but moments of pure presence I'd forgotten. The quality of light in my childhood bedroom on summer mornings, the precise sensation of diving into a cold lake on a hot day, conversations with mentors who had seen something in me I couldn't yet see in myself. The silence wasn't the absence of something, but the presence of everything that mattered, which I had ignored. This realization has historical precedent. When Thomas Carlyle's manuscript of the French Revolution was accidentally burned before publication, he was forced to rewrite the entire work from memory in a state of focused silence. The result wasn't just a reproduction, but a transformation, a work of greater depth and clarity than the original. His involuntary silence had become a crucible for creativity. Similarly, the composer Ludwig van Beethoven created some of his most transcendent works after becoming completely deaf. Freed from external sounds, he accessed a realm of pure musical thought that those with hearing could only glimpse. His silence wasn't a limitation, but an opening to depths inaccessible through ordinary means. My own modest revelation paled in comparison to these examples, but shared their essential quality. What I had perceived as loss had become, unexpectedly, a doorway. Around hour 53, I experienced my first genuine creative insight in years. Not the tactical problem-solving my work required, but the type of connection-making that feels like discovery rather than construction. Ideas linked themselves spontaneously, revealing patterns I'd never noticed. Questions I'd been carrying for years, about purpose, about authenticity, about the trajectory of my life, began arranging themselves into new configurations that pointed toward answers. The true solitude wasn't being with myself. It was being constantly with false versions of myself. This insight struck me with particular force. All those carefully curated playlists, podcasts, and social feeds weren't just distractions. They were constructions of identity, ways of telling myself stories about who I was. The music taste that signaled sophistication, the political podcasts that positioned me as informed and engaged, the social media that crafted a narrative of a life well lived. None of these were inherently problematic, but they had collectively formed a hall of mirrors where I encountered only reflections, never the source. By hour 56, I found myself mapping patterns in my life that had been invisible to me before. Recurring relationship dynamics, career decisions made from fear rather than aspiration, friendships maintained out of habit or convenience rather than genuine connection. These weren't comfortable realizations, but they didn't carry the same emotional charge as before. I could see them clearly, dispassionately, as if reviewing the life of someone I cared about but wasn't attached to. What I had interpreted as emptiness was actually space, not a tomb, but a womb where something new could be born. This perspective finds resonance in Eastern philosophical traditions. Buddhists speak of sunyata, or emptiness, not as nihilistic void, but as boundless potential. The Tao Te Ching reminds us that the usefulness of a vessel lies in its emptiness. These traditions recognized millennia ago what neuroscience confirms today. The mind requires empty space to function optimally. Constant input doesn't enhance cognition, it impairs it. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, spoke of the clearing of being, Lichtung, a space where things can show themselves as they truly are. It's not that truth is hidden in darkness, but that our constant busyness obscures the light already present. We don't need more information or stimulation. We need the capacity to see what's already before us. Heidegger spoke of the clearing of being. I finally understood that silence was that clearing, where I could at last see myself with clarity. Hour 58 brought what I can only describe as a profound shift in my relationship with silence. What had initially felt like an enemy to be fought, then a teacher to be endured, now revealed itself as something else entirely, a space of infinite possibility. Not empty but full, not dead but vibrantly alive. The silence had become a sanctuary, not from the world but for myself, a sacred space where I could finally hear the voice that had been trying to speak to me all along, my own. The most surprising paradox, the more I embraced the silence, the less alone I felt. This seems counterintuitive, but numerous studies on mindfulness and contemplative practices support this experience. Research from Carnegie Mellon University shows that periods of silence and meditation actually increase feelings of social connection and empathy. When we truly inhabit our own experience, we become more rather than less available to others. I thought of Henry David Thoreau, who retreated to Walden Pond not to escape humanity, but to find it in its essence. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately," he wrote, "to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach." Like Thoreau, I had accidentally stumbled upon a fundamental truth. We cannot truly connect with others until we have established connection with ourselves. And that connection requires, at least temporarily, the courage to be alone with our unmediated experience. As hour 60 approached, I felt a strange new emotion emerging, not euphoria or transcendence, but a quiet readiness. The mental storms had passed. The resistance had dissolved. In their place was a stillness that felt not like emptiness, but like potential. The blank page before writing, the deep breath before speaking, the moment of perfect balance before movement. What would happen now? How would this experience translate back into ordinary life, with its inevitable noise and distractions? I didn't yet know. But as I watched the sun begin to set on my third day of silence, I understood that something fundamental had shifted, not just in my experience, but in my relationship with experience itself. The silence was teaching me its final and most important lesson, one that would forever change how I understood not just quiet, but consciousness itself. The final 12 hours of my involuntary silence retreat unfolded like the closing movement of a symphony. Themes established earlier returned with new depth and resonance, building toward a resolution I couldn't have anticipated when this journey began. By hour 60, the silence had transformed from enemy to teacher to something else entirely, a field of pure potential. I found myself moving through the cabin with a strange new awareness, as if experiencing the physical world with senses that had been dormant my entire life. The texture of wooden floorboards under bare feet, the intricate patterns of condensation on window glass, the subtle variations in shadows as clouds passed over the sun. These weren't poetic observations, they were direct experiences, unmediated by commentary or comparison. What emerged wasn't a dramatic revelation, but a profound recalibration. Like a compass finally free from magnetic interference, my internal navigation system began orienting towards something that felt simultaneously new and deeply familiar, my own authentic north. The true purpose isn't found in the noise of our achievements, but in the silence that reveals why we achieve anything at all. This insight resonates with Viktor Frankl's discovery in Nazi concentration camps, where he observed that those who survived weren't necessarily the strongest physically, but those who maintained an inner sense of meaning. In the most extreme deprivation of external stimuli and comforts, these individuals discovered what Frankl later called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. My circumstances were incomparably more comfortable, yet the principle held: meaning emerges not from accumulation or distraction, but from our relationship with our own consciousness. As hour 66 approached, I began contemplating my inevitable return to the connected world. The thought no longer filled me with relief or anticipation, but with a question. How would I maintain this hard-won clarity amid the deluge of noise that awaited me? The answer came not as a rigid plan, but as a clear intention. I would no longer fear silence, but cultivate it, not as an escape from life, but as the foundation from which life could be more fully embraced. It isn't silence we should fear, but a life entirely lived in flight from it. History offers examples of those who understood this balance. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk and writer, maintained periods of profound silence within a life of active engagement with the world. Leonardo da Vinci alternated between intense social collaboration and solitary contemplation. More recently, figures like Bill Gates and Ray Dalio have incorporated think weeks of deliberate isolation into lives otherwise defined by constant connection and communication. These aren't practices of avoidance, but of integration, creating the conditions for depth in a world that ceaselessly pulls us toward the surface. By hour 70, I'd formulated my own modest version of this practice: daily periods of intentional silence. Not merely the absence of external noise, but a conscious turning toward my internal landscape with the same attention I'd habitually directed outward. A daily remembering of what these 72 hours had taught me. I had sought meaning in 1,000 external voices, when the only one that could truly guide me was the one I constantly silenced. Modern neuroscience validates this approach. Studies at UCLA demonstrated that regular meditation, a formalized practice of attentive silence, physically alters brain structure, increasing density in regions associated with awareness, empathy, and self-regulation. What contemplative traditions have claimed for millennia, science now confirms. Silence isn't merely the absence of input, but an active state with profound physiological and psychological benefits. As the 72-hour mark approached, bringing with it the likelihood of power restoration, I realized that the transformation wasn't in what I'd discovered about silence, but in what silence had revealed about everything else. My relationships appeared in a new light, not as distractions or obligations, but as opportunities for genuine connection that could only happen from a place of internal coherence. My work no longer seemed like a series of tasks to complete, but an expression of values and purpose that required regular reconnection with my deeper intentions. I now understand that silence isn't the opposite of sound, but its foundation, just as self-knowledge isn't the opposite of connection, but its prerequisite. This perspective echoes the wisdom of Carl Jung, who wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The journey inward isn't a retreat from the world, but the necessary preparation for meaningful engagement with it. When power was finally restored early on the 4th day, I didn't immediately reach for my devices. Instead, I sat with the awareness that I now had a choice about how to re-engage with technology, not from compulsion but from intention. Not as an escape from myself, but as an extension of a self I was now committed to knowing. In the months since that accidental retreat, I've found that maintaining a relationship with silence isn't about dramatic gestures or perfect consistency. It's about regular moments of remembering, of consciously unplugging, not just from devices, but from the habit of distraction itself. Some days this means a morning meditation. Other days, a walk without headphones. Sometimes, simply driving without the radio or sitting with a cup of tea, allowing thoughts to arise and pass without reaching for my phone. The effects have been subtle but profound. Conversations have deepened, unburdened by the need to fill every moment with sound. Creative insights arrive more freely, emerging from the spaces I now allow, rather than the information I constantly consume. Decisions align more consistently with my values, guided by an internal voice that's grown clearer with regular listening. Just last month, during a critical meeting where my team was deadlocked on opposing strategies, I resisted my old impulse to fill the uncomfortable silence with a hasty compromise. Instead, I allowed the tension to exist. And in that space, a colleague offered a perspective that transcended the apparent dichotomy, leading to our most innovative campaign in years. In my personal life, a relationship that had existed primarily in shared activities and constant conversation has evolved into something deeper, where comfortable silences have become as meaningful as our words. Like a diver who finally learns to breathe comfortably in the depths, I've discovered that what once seemed like a hostile environment, the silence of my own consciousness, has become the element in which I move most freely. Silence didn't give me answers. It gave me something far more valuable: the ability to live comfortably with the questions. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson we can extract from the depths of silence. It's not in certainty, but in conscious doubt that we find our most authentic humanity. As Rilke wrote, "Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." I am the Shadow Therapist, and this was an exploration of how our fear of silence reveals our fear of ourselves, and how that very silence can become the portal to our deepest liberation. If you seek more investigations into the shadows we cast and the lights we conceal, subscribe to this channel. Because in the end, The only truly meaningful noise is that which is born from conscious silence. And together, we can learn to hear the inaudible. The philosopher Kierkegaard observed that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. In our noise-filled world, we've become masters at problem-solving, but novices at experiencing. We've mistaken information for wisdom, connection for communion, and stimulation for aliveness. The silence waits patiently for each of us, not as an empty void to be feared, but as the fertile ground from which a more authentic life can grow. The journey toward it may begin with discomfort, even terror, but what awaits on the other side is not the abyss we fear, but the home we've been seeking all along.